think, folks? Should we start?
Let's give her.
I was just doing the thing where I was watching the Cesar and Dave's OBS tutorial like 5 minutes before, and then Dave was like on that recording. He's like, "Don't do that. Like, watch it." Well, it was like too late. Already did. All right. All right. Let's get started. Everybody ready?
Yep.
All right. I'll start, and then whoever wants to pick it up after me, just jump right in. So, chapter 2, called False Hope. This chapter lays out how American politicians deal with the unsolvable problem. The core of its argument is simple. 1. In the long run, elected politicians need to prioritize winning elections. This is not to say that they don't have other values and goals, but politicians have chosen to pursue their goals through the electoral system. They can't pursue any of their further goals if they don't win elections. Politicians who do not prioritize winning elections tend to be outcompeted by those who do. 2. Because the unsolvable problem is unsolvable for the reasons given in the first chapter, politicians cannot get votes by tackling it. 3. If politicians need votes but they cannot solve voters' problems, they must find a way to get votes without solving problems. They do this by fostering false hope and a dawn that never comes. This chapter is about how American politicians get votes without solving problems. We'll talk about politicians from 3 different movements: left-wing movement built around Bernie Sanders, the right-wing movement built around Donald Trump, and the centrist movement that is currently led, at least nominally, by Joe Biden. That was like, I'm going to call that 3 paragraphs, so I'll do one more. In the 2010s, it briefly looked like there might be a revival of the left. Bernie Sanders did much better in the 2016 Democratic primaries than expected. His 2016 campaign focused heavily around protecting ordinary Americans from the consequences of our competitive global economy. Sanders hoped to make healthcare, education, and employment more secure and more accessible. He promised Medicare for all, tuition, free college, infrastructure spending, and even a jobs guarantee. Despite the decline of trade unions, Sanders was able to use the internet to raise an enormous amount of money. His campaign worked around the corporate media, reaching voters directly through Facebook groups like Bernie Sanders, Dank Meme Stash, and inspiring a fresh crop of independent outlets like Jacobin and Current Affairs. It also spawned a number of podcasts like Chapo Trap House. Even at the beginning, there were some questions. How far did Sanders really plan to go? Sanders kept a relatively low profile on foreign policy. He was quick to criticize U.S. military interventions overseas, but he avoided explicitly challenging the institutional structure of the global economic system. We knew Sanders wanted to revise trade deals to protect American workers, and we also knew how he felt. We also knew how he felt. We also knew he felt that the United States needed to lead on climate change, but he didn't indicate any comprehensive plan to rein in capital mobility. Would Sanders bring back capital controls to stop the rich from moving their money abroad? Would he use American power to push other countries to cooperate on regional and global wealth taxes? Would he revise the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organizations? If Sanders had answers to these questions, he wasn't sharing.
There were political questions, too. How would Sanders build a legislative majority in Congress? His fundraising techniques were sufficient to fund a competitive presidential campaign, but they couldn't support a national slate of candidates in down-ballot races. In the years following 2016, organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, Brand New Congress, and the Justice Democrats tried to offer support to down-ballot candidates, but they concentrated their operations in major cities. Sanders himself won primaries in many rural red states, with strong showings in places like Utah, Idaho, Kansas, and North Dakota. But only a handful of left candidates were elected to Congress in the years following 2016, and most of the winners came from Democratic safe seats in blue cities, where Hillary Clinton was popular. Because most of these candidates represent districts with heavy Democratic majorities, they have little incentive to reach out to rural voters in red states. For them, re-election depends on keeping partisan Democrats happy. Partisan Democrats want their representatives to take polarizing progressive stances on social and cultural issues. You don't say. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, for instance, has publicly supported defunding the police and abolishing both Immigration, Customs and Enforcement, ICE, and the Department of Homeland Security. These positions consistently poll poorly, but Ocasio-Cortez's bright blue district gives her little political incentive to build consensus. By wading into wedge issues, these candidates have secured support from voters in their own districts at the cost of damaging their national appeal and the national appeal of the left as a whole. A study Jacobin ran in cooperation with YouGov found that the activist rhetoric associated with Ocasio-Cortez is dramatically less effective than Bernie Sanders' bread and butter economic messaging. This holds even among the racial groups that activist messaging purports to target. A majority of Black Americans want to maintain the existing level of police presence. Hispanic Americans do not behave like a unitary voting bloc in the first instance. And then we have a couple of tables here. Let's see. This first one says, the DSA succeeds only where Hillary Clinton is popular. Okay, so on the first column, we have the members of Congress in the DSA, and then the next column is that district's 2016 Hillary Clinton vote share. So for Rashida Tlaib, it's 78.8% Hillary Clinton vote share in 2016. For Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, it's 77.7%. Cori Bush is 77%. Jamal Bowman is 75.1%. Greg Cesar is 63.6%. And yeah, so yeah, there's a really strong correlation between Hillary supporting districts and those who voted in DSA Congress members. That's actually very interesting. And then there's a second table. Okay, it's similar, but it's about the Justice Democrat candidates this time instead of DSA members. Okay, so we have Ayanna Pressley at 84.1%, Pramila Jayapal, 82.1%, Ro Khanna, 73.9%, Ilhan Omar at 73.7%, and Raul Grijalva at 62.4%. So for the less people who can't visualize tables in their heads, I certainly can't. I think the main thing here is that there's a really strong correlation between like Hillary Clinton supporters and people who voted in DSA Congress members or Justice Democrat Congress members. Yeah, does someone want to take it from here?
I can jump in. If left-wing activists were members of the working class, they might have picked up on the unpopularity of their messages. But the activists are disproportionately college-educated. Many of them are fallen professionals. As we discussed in the last chapter, fallen professionals do not necessarily make more money than workers. Because their degrees have failed to translate into high-status, high-salary jobs, they cannot distinguish themselves from ordinary workers in traditional ways. They can only assert their superiority by emphasizing the ways in which they are culturally different from workers. Activist language is the language they learned to speak in college. Speaking the language becomes a virtue marker, a way of displaying moral and cultural superiority. This makes them extremely reluctant to abandon the language, even when it would clearly benefit the political movements they support. If they back away from the language, they must also give up the sense of moral and cultural superiority they get from speaking it. The psychological benefits of the language are, and I mean this with compassionate sincerity, too crucial to their mental health to be given up. Fallen professionals must continue to use this language. Even though working class voters experience the language as condescending and alienating. The language is so important to their sense of self that political defeat is preferable to abandoning it. Left activists are constantly looking for new terms they can use to remind themselves and others that they went to college. and this means they are constantly looking for new ways to alienate working class voters. The more precarious the fallen professionals become economically, the more they fixate on activist language. As things get worse for the fallen professionals economically, they become less and less able to reach out politically to other classes. Their movements become more insular, more defensive, and more politically hopeless.
Can I actually comment here real quick?
Yeah.
I just want to add that, like, I know a lot of people that are using the language of the fallen professionals in the PMC and, like, don't have a degree, never went to university. They're working low-wage jobs. And they still, and this is me, but I know a lot of people like me as well. So I think there's, like, it's a bit more complicated how people get to the language. Like, I think for my age category, if you didn't go to university, you might have gotten it from Tumblr, for example. So I think that, like, yeah, I just wanted to add that piece in that I think it totally might be starting in the academy, but, like, you don't have to go to the academy to, yeah, kind of find yourself talking like this and kind of being invested in this, in language more than, you know, actual goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
would
think
agree
it's.
with that.
You think it is downstream of the academy though? Here.
Sure, like I think a lot of the language probably started there. So I guess in that sense it would be downstream. But I don't know. I think that the way that we use the internet has really sort of complicated and maybe made like more of a web out of influence, you know, where it's kind of going in a lot of different directions at the same time rather
Yeah.
than like this clear sort of top down thing necessarily.
Right.
I think you make a really good point here because when you mentioned the fact that professionals in your life or not professionals, it's in fact the opposite. Like you said, they hadn't gone to school, they hadn't gotten a degree, they were working class jobs. Where are they? What is the connection? Who is the person that's sending this? That's creating this vernacular or this context, right? How the hell did I get it? I flunked out of school. I barely got my OSSD, and I haven't been inside a university except to grift off of lectures like I am a student because I'm a nerd. So when you mentioned what was it that you had mentioned you were seeing it? Yeah, it was online. Yeah, and that's what I've been seeing a lot of people talk about when they're analyzing Trump and why they thought he was going to lose because all of his stuff was very all the rhetoric he was using, all the stories that he was telling, they were very they signaled that he was getting a lot of that information from like the deep online right, just like you might see this kind of language permeate, like you said, as a web part of a web, literally from the web. So that's a very good point, I think. I don't know what Benjamin would say about that, but yeah.
There probably is also like a feedback thing going on where like the internet is influenced by the academy and then the internet goes back and influences the academy as well. But
Well, I mean, we
the
aren't sitting
reason,
on a call doing it right now, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly, totally, we are. Yeah, you're right. But yeah, it's like I just remember having this incredible culture shock though, where like I'm from like a conservative household, and then like I've said before, like through kind of a fluke, they just happened to have the program. I went to college in a very liberal college, and I was like, just I had never heard of the woke politics. The extent that they were doing it was just like there were like safety warnings on posters on the wall, like these are the offensive words that you can't use, and like one of them was bitch, like don't say this even if you mean it as a joke. And just like a level of that I had never experienced before. I was like, what is going on? This is so weird. But yeah, I don't know. So like I feel like it is at the downstream of the academy, but you make a really good point for sure here that it's not. It does get a lot more complicated than just those who go to college, those who don't. You know, I think that
Yeah, and it's definitely, I mean, people entered and left the academy at different times, and so many people understand to a degree, but they don't have the latest update. So, so it's like
Right.
they knew what the rules were, but then it's like, okay, what are the rules now?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. And the internet keeps changing the rules too. That then the academy accepts or doesn't, you know. Anyway. Was it David reading last? Do you want to keep going there, David?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool.
Here we
I
go.
think you have 2 more paragraphs. If we're doing like 4-ish.
Okay,
Cool.
sweet. All right, let's see. We got this is not the first time activist language has undermined the political growth of the left. In the late 60s and early 70s, George McGovern ran a campaign that was radical on social issues and foreign policy. His campaign pleased college students but alienated working class voters. Between 2016 and 2020, the Sanders movement began to McGovernize, to pander to the cultural tastes of professionals, driving away workers with more moderate and conservative cultural stances. Professionals have more cultural capital than workers. When professionals and workers join the same movements, the professionals tend to dominate decision making. Their tastes and preferences often win out, and the workers get marginalized. Organizations like the DSA work hard to prevent white men from dominating discussions, but it's harder to stop McGovernization. The distinction between professionals and workers is less visible and more easily blurred. Debates about the demographics of DSA often focus on race and income, but refuse to engage questions about educational background. Raising this issue makes people angry. It was hard to stop McGovernization in the 70s when most college students still stood a chance of having lucrative professional careers. It is even harder to stop it now when so many college educated people are in precarious positions. Their economic and social vulnerability drives them into anxiety and depression. It leaves them with little choice but to sneer at ordinary workers as a means of salvaging what remains of their sense of self. Changing strategy becomes psychologically impossible, regardless of its political benefits. As the Sanders movement became more and more associated with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her squad, it became more dependent on blue cities and college towns where large numbers of fallen professionals live. It lost ground in rural areas and it failed to break through with Black voters in southern states. In 2016, Sanders won 32 rural counties in Iowa. In 2020, he won only 15. In 2016, Sanders won all of New Hampshire's 8 rural counties. In 2020, he lost 3 of those 8. By the time the 2020 primaries were over, Sanders had lost his 2016 pluralities in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, West Virginia, Maine, and Rhode Island. In exchange, he gained only California and Nevada. Doesn't seem like a good exchange there.
Yeah. Who's next?
I can jump in. I was ADD brain made me go into another tab for a second. Where are we? I was more listening than tracking.
We're at are you looking at the screen share I'm doing? It's highlighted. If
Yeah,
you
it's oh, you've highlighted it. Okay.
yeah, there you go.
Sanders is fighting shit like that. Oh, this Sanders is aging in his down ballot. Is that the one?
Yep.
Okay. I pressed the wrong button, so I'm getting back to it, which is delaying me here. Sorry. Where are you? Here. Yeah, Sanders is aging, and his down ballot allies are too polarizing to gain hegemony within the Democratic Party, let alone the country at large. As it has become more obvious that this movement isn't going to be able to deliver policies, some of Sanders' old campaign promises have fallen by the wayside. even during the 2020 campaign itself, Ocasio-Cortez suggested that Medicare for All could be little more than a negotiating tactic to achieve a public option for health insurance. When the campaign ended, Medicare for All virtually disappeared from her Twitter feed. Sanders' jobs guarantee was downgraded to a human infrastructure bill. That bill, in turn, failed to pass. Eventually, Congress incorporated some of the bill's measures into the Inflation Reduction Act, but that act is almost 80% smaller than the original human infrastructure bill. It in no way amounts to anything like a job guarantee. President Biden showed an interest in making community colleges tuition free, but he never showed any interest in extending this to 4-year public universities. Damn, I need my glasses. And eventually, even the community college provision was dropped from the bill. I can feel the radiation of the screen on my nose. What happens when a political movement is strong enough to win a handful of elections in fringe congressional districts, but is not strong enough to produce anything like a governing majority? Its
Hey, Mike,
politicians have to fight.
So do you want me to zoom in? Are you looking at my screen? I can zoom in.
No,
more.
no. I'm looking at my own screen. It's
okay.
not at all your fault. No, it's my laptop. It's just for some reason I didn't put them within reach. So now I like my neck's craned and stuff. It's 4 paragraphs. I can get through it.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
No, it's fine. That's fine. If we finish that question, you said its politicians have to find some way of appearing effective. They slowly shift the goalposts. They quietly abandon their transformative policy goals and instead offer their supporters the satisfaction of symbolic victories. Instead of fighting for big legislation, they fight to embarrass their opponents on television and on Twitter. They make viral videos. They work with the center of the party because working with the center is the only way to win even small victories. They talk those petty victories up and present them as grand triumphs. I think that's paragraph 2, but it feels like these are really small paragraphs. Gradually, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Gradually, a symbiotic relationship forms between the Bernie-crats in Congress and the Democratic Party establishment. The Bernie-crats discipline the base voters, ensuring that they remain Democrats. By continuing to hang around, the Bernie-crats give the Democratic base voters false hope that one day the Democratic Party will move in their direction. The Bernie-crats critique the party from within, and their critiques create an impression of intellectual diversity and vibrancy within the party. They tell the base voters that they will push the party to the left. If the base voters just work hard to get them reelected and to elect more Bernie-crats to Congress one day, they'll have the members to move transformative legislation. The base voters are kept on a hope treadmill. That's a nice term. Supporting the Democrats in the hope that the Bernie-crats will one day succeed in improving the Democratic Party from within. That day never comes, and in the meantime, Bernie-crats reliably endorse establishment Democrats in general elections. The Bernie-crats discipline their supporters by fear-mongering about the Republicans. They tell the base voters that Republicans are hateful bigots, even authoritarian fascists, and therefore the base voters must vote blue no matter who. If the base voters refuse, they are accused of aiding and abetting fascism. I think these are probably quotes. They're not data-rich figures like the ones that Keir was going through. So, but let me know if I'm wrong and if we need to go over those figures. Bernie Sanders and congressional Bernie-crats vouched for Joe Biden and urged their supporters to show up and support him. They said that they will push Joe Biden to the left, that they would make him the most progressive president in history. These were promises they could not keep and are not keeping. By performing their disciplinary role, the Bernie-crats provide a service to the party establishment. In exchange, they enjoy long and lucrative careers as members of Congress, securing committee appointments and book deals. The party establishment welcomes their criticism. It is because the Bernie-crats present themselves as internal critics that the anti-establishment voters trust them. Their status as critics makes them highly effective at managing dissent. And then I think we're at the next heading.
Freaking Benjamin always says like some nascent thought that I have,
Yeah,
like, rattling, and then Benjamin just like actually articulates something that I'm like, yeah, that's vaguely what I'm mad about, but I don't know how to say it.
yeah, definitely. So I usually at the end of a paragraph like that, I would say bars. That's bars.
Yeah, for real. Because like, I mean, that like my problem with the DSA, and I kind of complain about them a lot, is that like just like no sense that no, there needs to be a radical break from the Democratic Party. They're not your friends. They're not on our side, you know. And that's why I'm just like I've burned out rapidly on the DSA. I'm just like, what? Why do you think that these people care about you any more than the Republicans do? I really don't understand. And why even critique them from the inside? Why have any attachment to their policies at all? I just don't get it. I don't get what the
Yeah, this is
logic
why
is.
I like Benjamin's thoughts on legitimation and how legitimation works. I think it's one of the strongest forces, like just psychological forces, is like that legitimation that like, well, you know, this is the handle we pull on the machine that gives me a driver's license, on a machine that gets my kids through school, on a machine that, you know, that's what they look like.
Yeah.
You can change the face, but they have to wear that, and they have to stand in that building, and they have to have that form, and they got to use that pen, and they're open during this, you know, the pain. People recognize the pain. They're like, oh, the DMV, you know, must be the DMV. Is this the DMV? Oh, I've confused it with the DMV because it's so painful. Like, it's a learned helplessness.
Yeah, and that last sentence, their status as critics make them highly effective at managing dissent. That's a perfect sentence.
It's excellent. It's a very like it's the I think fifth columns are defined this way. I can't I've got a very associative tendency, so I might just be blurring the lines between them, but definitely, you know, a controlled opposition that actually serves to strengthen the relative position, not through internal strength, but through external weakening.
And they think they're free and autonomous. Meanwhile, they're just getting used.
Well, yeah, right, because there's this whole I vote or I go to the DSA. You know, even if I'm just voting, at least I go to the DSA before. At least I do something that's more democratic than the goofy primary, right? Like they exercise their rights in that way, but like there's no because there's such a lack of energy because people are so busy. Anyway, I'm starting to fly off the handle. Go ahead.
No, I just have a friend who compared the if you ever watch this, I'm talking about no, I'm just kidding. But like I have a friend who compared going to the DSA as going to church. Like I just show up and I go to church every weekend, and I'm like, okay, comparing that to like the modern incarnation of the evangelical church that really demands absolutely nothing of you either, except that you go to church occasionally, is like, well, there's your problem. You're comparing it to what we know of going to the church, which is totally asks nothing of you, you know?
Except for your money.
Yeah, except for a little tithe, I guess. But even that's
Well, I mean,
voluntary.
over time, like I don't know what it's like. I guess I've never been to any like Baptist or evangelical or sort of that kind of um oh, I can't remember what side of the, you know, genealogy of the church it is, but even up here in Canada, it's like you're there long enough and they start to recognize your face, they are going to start to feel whether or not their pockets are sufficiently filled out. Like that's like corporeal to them. They're like, you know, we see you here all the time. You don't seem to give as much as everybody else. What's going on? It's a very weird socially regulatory like instinct that just kind of, and I don't know if, you know, I guess I haven't been to the like the annals of the authority of the church, so I can't really say like how they set it in motion or who sets it in motion or where it comes from, but it's there, at least in Canada, and I would be aghast if it was not very similar, just because, you know, it's Canada. We're like 10% of the U.S. We can't impress that, except for maybe Drake. We haven't really had a good, you know, cultural push.
Well, you know, I mean, it's somebody like somebody who studies theology, right? I mean, the parallels are endless. It really fits. I mean, I one of my mentors was definitely like, you know, a cultural Christian, but no, he's a cultural communist, right? And because, you know, he's like a red diaper baby, like multi-generational CPUSA guy. And yeah, it's just like that. It's just like this is you know, and so that's a stratum. Now he's the one who pulled twisted my arm and said, "You're coming to Iowa for Bernie Sanders. You're doing it." And I said, "Okay, Ben, okay, I'll do it." But yeah, it and you know, you see this in various phases of decay where people get fatigued from that narrative that they're making a powerful internal critique that will shift the Democrats. Like you see it, like I was with the Green Party for a while, and you see people who are like slowly coming out of it, and it's like it's phases of decay in different places. Yeah, but
All right. Should we keep on moving? Who's next?
Here, I'll jump in
Left
here,
as
man.
hope industry. Yay, Nance.
I'll jump in. The left as hope industry. Some people's jobs depend on the idea of a viable American left. These people work in politics. They work for campaigns. They write for progressive and socialist newspapers and magazines. They publish books with left-wing presses. They run podcasts. They work for think tanks. Whatever their specific roles, they get most of their income from political work on behalf of left causes. They are the professional left. For these people, the argument I'm making about the American left directly challenges the value of their work. It undermines their ability to raise money. If it spreads, this argument may threaten their jobs and their livelihoods. They have every incentive to resist the argument. They need to convince their audiences that the left has hope, because it is hope that drives people not just to vote, but to read, to listen, to donate, to buy things. The need to maintain hope forces the professional left to adopt increasingly strained positions. Let's start with an example. In 2021, there was a special election for a seat in Congress. The seat was in Ohio, in a district where Hillary Clinton received 80.5% of the vote in 2016, and Joe Biden received 79.8% of the vote in 2020. It's a heavily gerrymandered district containing parts of both Cleveland and Akron. This is the kind of seat the left has been targeting. It's a Democratic safe seat. It's not remotely representative of the country as a whole. In the Democratic primaries, the left ran Nina Turner, a former co-chair of Sanders' 2020 campaign and the president of Our Revolution, a pro-Sanders political action organization. But Turner lost to Shontel Brown, an establishment candidate, 50 to 45%. Even in this very unusual, heavily gerrymandered seat, the left was defeated. If the left can't win in seats like this, how is it supposed to win power within the Democratic Party, let alone the country as a whole? Nina Turner is a signature figure within the Sanders movement. The left poured an immense amount of money and effort into her campaign. In February, just 6 months before the primary, Turner had $650,000 to Brown's $40,000. Yet, she still lost. How could this have happened? The result undermined the left's strategy. It challenged its narrative. Most importantly, it threatened the hope that pays the bills. This needed to be explained away. Writing for Jacobin, Luke Savage chalked the whole thing up to a late influx of dark money for Brown. Right-wing super PAC Democratic Majority for Israel alone spent over $2 million on ads mostly attacking Turner and making no actual mention of Israel, combined with another $500,000 chipped in from corporate AstroTurf group Third Way. Funds that poured in to crush Turner's campaign closed in on $3 million, a breathtaking sum for a special election hold in the doldrums of late summer. If there's any lesson to be drawn from the Ohio 11th race, it's about the lengths to which the Democratic machine will ultimately go to defeat its harshest critics, and the lows to which it is willing to stoop. With the aid of big donors, some of whom were quite literally Republicans, centrists and party grandees successfully prevented the election of a left-wing progressive in a safe blue district. While the Turner-Brown contest may be an extreme case, the basic template it represents is almost certain to play out again as long as the Democratic Party retains its indefensible addiction to corporate donors and organized money. Special interests and lobby organizations spend millions of dollars on elections because those dollars usually get them the desired result.
Everyone gone who wants to go? Is there anyone else? Is that everybody? I think that's everybody. All right, I'll go then. Cool. And let one. Wait, we've got 1, 2, 3. Ian could go if you want to.
I'm good though. I'm doing some chores.
Okay,
Oh,
cool.
I have the text here.
Oh yeah, Brian, you haven't gone yet.
Yeah.
That's right.
His
Go
last
ahead.
word was desired. It was desired result, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
The trouble is that if this is true, it's not obvious how the left could possibly defeat the Democratic machine. Even modest campaign finance reform bills like the 2002 McCain-Feingold Act have been gutted by the Supreme Court. To change the composition of the court, the left would need to win the presidency and the Senate. To win the presidency and the Senate, the left would need to win elections. To win elections, the left needs campaign finance reform. It's a catch-22. But by blaming the power of dark money, Savage is able to divert criticism away from Turner's campaign and from the left's political strategy. To save the movement, he blames the system. Several months earlier, Luke Savage wrote a different piece for Jacobin. In that piece, he pointed out that campaign finance reform isn't enough. Canada has strong campaign finance laws. Hey, Canada. But Canadian billionaires still avoid taxes, and Canadian unions are still declining. He wrote, restricting the power of money to influence politics may be urgent and necessary, but it does little to alter the ideological preferences of those who traditionally staff the halls of power. Which is all to say, the left cannot hope that fairer rules alone will facilitate its agenda, or that liberal capitalism instantly becomes an easier environment in which to make gains once the nexus binding lawmakers and wealthy donors has been severed. If the left can't win elections under the current rules, it can't change the rules, and it wouldn't be able to win even if the rules were changed. Where is the hope? The professional left maintains the status quo by manufacturing hope where there is no justification for it. On August 27th, 2021, Bernie Sanders held a town hall in West Lafayette, Indiana, to raise support for Joe Biden's human infrastructure bill. During the Q&A, one brave soul told Sanders his friends were getting disillusioned. What would Bernie say to those who feel disappointed, who feel that the American political system doesn't work? Sanders said his supporters should feel good because people like Cori Bush and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been elected to Congress. He told his supporters they had already succeeded in raising consciousness. If Sanders has raised consciousness and raising consciousness is good enough, why did Nina Turner lose in a bright blue, heavily gerrymandered Democratic safe seat? If campaign finance laws have to change for the left to win, how can the left change campaign finance laws without winning? If campaign finance laws aren't enough to win anyway, why shouldn't Sanders supporters feel disillusioned? Why should they continue to give their hard-earned money to left-wing organizations that have no viable strategy to win power? The professional left has no good answers to these questions. Each time one of them is asked, it responds by shifting the goalposts. Challenge the strategy, and they blame the system for electoral defeats. Point out flaws in the system, and they credit the strategy with raising consciousness. Whatever the cost, the strategy must be protected because the strategy is the cow that keeps on giving. The strategy is what pays the bills. But the strategy makes no sense politically. There aren't enough Democratic safe seats to give the left a governing majority, even if it started winning those seats consistently, and the left isn't winning even those seats consistently. The harder it tries to win these races, the more it caters to a fringe minority of voters, and the harder it is for the left to compete nationally in more competitive races. Even if the strategy were working, it would fail. It's not as if this critique applies to every member of the professional left across the board. In that Jacobin YouGov study, there was an acknowledgement that activist language is counterproductive at the national level. If you ask them in a vacuum, many of these people might very well agree that left-wing campaigns shouldn't alienate people, that they should speak to universal economic needs. But in practice, the left continues to run the bulk of its candidates in heavily gerrymandered Democratic safe seats. As long as it does that, its candidates will continue to pander to the activists who dominate the political scene in those safe seats. And those candidates will poison the well for other left wing candidates in other areas who try other approaches. The people who work in left wing media have to find some way to attract an audience despite those defeats. The Sanders movement gave birth to a whole cottage industry, and this industry is desperately trying to survive, even as the political movement dies. To keep going, it needs to generate hope while keeping expectations manageable. Wherever possible, it emphasizes its ability to raise consciousness, playing up the significance of its cultural impact. At the same time, it constantly emphasizes the structural obstacles it faces: dark money, voter suppression, the Senate, the Electoral College, and the Supreme Court. Every victory, however small, is evidence of its ostensibly transformed cultural impact. Every defeat, however large, is just one more reminder that the system is implacably corrupt. But if you look closely, you'll see that the left isn't just failing in America, it's failing in European countries that have many of the procedural reforms it calls for. There are European countries with proportional representation, unicameral legislatures, weak or non existent judicial review, strong campaign finance laws, and high levels of voter participation. But all of these countries remain trapped in our competitive global economy. Even in France and Germany, economic inequality is rising. Left wing writers know this, and they endlessly lament the slow erosion of social programs and safety nets abroad. Jacobin is routinely full to bursting with articles about how the European left is failing. They've even published many pieces on the slow decline of the Scandinavian social programs. Yet at the same time, left wing writers argue over and over for the adoption of European democratic procedures. It's a dead end hiding in plain sight.
That sounds pretty accurate.
I'm happy to hear that we're showing that I don't know. I guess Canada and the UK are kind of knocked off their pedestal, because there's probably if I'm any indication, there are definitely people who are sick of hearing how much better Canada is when like we're just watching it crumble from the inside. There's this edifice of like public health care and like all this stuff, and like and that in a mirror image of that, in the Lacanian sense, there's this topsy-turvy world where there's this legitimation of the structures by this same dynamic where we're raising awareness, but we can't fight the government's underfunding of healthcare systems and this and that, but we're raising awareness. Like it's the mirror image of it. It's fascinating. Go ahead, John.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it seems like people in the EU say very similar things, where it's just like like maybe it's better for now, but it's like under rapid assault and crumbling as we speak. So
It's like, yes, we do have public health care, and I would never want to live in the States because we have public health care here. I can walk into a doctor's office for free, or a hospital for free. But also, yeah, there's no health care for your eyes, your ears, your teeth, and most medication. So as long as you don't have any problems with any of those. And then there's also like, it feels awkward to talk about this as a leftist, but there's like a type of rationing where it's like you have to. I know someone who had hepatitis, I can't remember which type, but basically it's like it's curable, but the medication to cure it is so expensive that you have to be actively dying and that's when they'll give it to you. So he spent years and years in decline before he could get the treatment, So
oh my God.
yeah, you don't want to like romanticize the healthcare system up here, even if I think it is superior in a number of measures to the US, because it's like the US has like the worst in all of the developed world, right? So it's easier to be like quote unquote better than the American system.
Oh yeah,
But
when
it's
I
like-
was
It's like my strategy for like the strategy here for going to the doctor if you don't have health insurance is just like go to an emergency room and then
No,
they
man.
can't bankrupt you for
Go to
whatever.
jail, dude.
Like,
You get arrested. That's how you get health care in America.
Healthcare, housing, right?
Yeah. You either join the army or you go to jail, or you do both.
Facts. Join the
Not
army
that,
or go to jail, dude. Economic draft.
so like a little over a year ago when I was newer to like so I moved to Toronto from Boston and I was in the a van with all these Iranian immigrants to Canada and they were complaining because they had been in Europe and they said, oh no, like you guys pay so much and you don't get that much for it in Canada. It's not just healthcare but safety regulations and so many things like the employers get away with murder. Like it's
Yeah,
like
that's exactly right.
yeah.
Yeah, it's sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just I meant to affirm what you were saying. Sorry.
No, no, absolutely. I'm just no, and I appreciate. I mean, if you have more to say on that, like you may know
But
some of the.
the
Well, I
Iranians are
mean,
saying that to the Canadians? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
mhm.
we are to his point. I think that's Brian speaking. I apologize if I've got your name wrong. Um, but yeah, we have like statistically, and this is something that a lot of Canadians are aware in terms of like marginal effectiveness of the dollars we spend on healthcare. It's exceedingly low. Our efficiency per dollar is, and this is what's the real tragedy about what's happening in other European continental democracies where they have this public health care is that they're declining in similarly you might say like they're falling down the same flight of stairs, but they're further up it, and they're having these same problems of losing this stability and losing ground in the places where we could only hope to go, and actually like improve our interface with both ends of that tube where the money goes in and the money comes out, and it gets the work done. We're putting more in the tube and we're getting less out of that other end of the tube, or at least we're getting less when it comes out the other side than they even are. So like, what happens when we win the efficiency we're looking for? Do we just keep falling down the stairs too? It's terrifying.
Yeah, and the other thing that's really hard is like the hardest thing to do is to get like if it just polarizes into the market and the state, right? And but then the civil society and these intermediary right institutions just wither away. You're in trouble, like where how can you yeah, I don't know, just for various reasons. I mean, we all know this sociology, maybe we've seen it like this kind of bowling alone thing, right? Where you just get increasingly atomized and you don't have these, kind of community organizations. It's just like it's your, individuals and like the family as the family also has its problems and is like being worn down. So you're just exposed. Um,
I'll start off the rights rabbit hole. All right.
Cool.
Unlike Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump actually became president. For that reason alone, the right appears more politically successful than the left. It is also useful for both the left and the center to portray the right as successful. If the right is succeeding, then it is threatening. Fear is hope's counterpart, for fear relies on the idea that the enemy's hope is well founded. But what would it mean for the right to succeed? During the 2016 campaign, Donald Trump promised to repatriate manufacturing jobs to the United States by embracing a policy of protectionism. But the jobs never came back. In 1979, 8.66% of American workers in manufacturing, oh, sorry, Americans worked in manufacturing. When Trump took office in 2017, 3.78% of Americans held manufacturing jobs. When he left office in 2021, the figure was 3.67%. The total number of manufacturing jobs peaked in 1979 at 19.5 million. In January 2017, there were 12.3 million left. In January 2021, there were just 12.2 million. Even before the coronavirus in January 2020, there were only 12.7 million manufacturing jobs. At no point did the number of manufacturing jobs come within sniffing distance of the pre-2008 level, 13.7 million, let alone the 1979 peak. This is not to say that the Trump administration did nothing to make good on its promises. Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. He renegotiated NAFTA. He imposed tariffs on two-thirds Chinese imports. But for all the sound and fury, these policies did not even begin to make a real dent. All told, America imported 3.4% more in 2020 during the height of the pandemic than it imported in 2016. During the same period, the trade deficit fell by almost 15%. Goods imported from China fell 6%, and they rose 88% in Vietnam. The jobs didn't come back. They slid down the coast from Shanghai to Saigon. When the coronavirus hit, the administration had an opportunity to escalate its protectionist agenda. Supply chains were already being disrupted by lockdowns. If the administration had acted to restructure the global economic system, it could have blamed the economic fallout on the pandemic. But instead, the administration became increasingly worried about re-election. There were no new tariffs on Chinese imports in 2020, and the tariff rate was slightly reduced. I think that was 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'll jump in here.
Okay, go ahead, Kier.
Donald Trump also promised to clamp down on tax avoidance by billionaires, even pledging to raise taxes on himself. This, of course, never happened. Instead, the race to the bottom on taxes accelerated. Trump cut the top rate of individual income tax from 39.6% to 37%. He cut the top rate of corporate income tax from 35 to 21%. Holy crap. The federal deficit increased as a percent of GDP from 3.4% in 2017 to 4.6% in 2019, before ballooning to 15% in 2020 during the pandemic. The administration argued these cuts were necessary to bring back manufacturing jobs. But those jobs never returned, and the cuts eroded the government's future ability to invest in infrastructure and support public services. The Trump administration promised to make major investments in infrastructure, but it was never able to come up with the money. The administration repeatedly found that congressional Republicans were only intermittently interested in working with it. The party establishment was happy to support tax cuts. George W. Bush cut taxes when he became president, and Mitt Romney promised tax cuts in 2012. But when the president needed votes for infrastructure, he could never find them. Opposition from libertarians was especially fierce. They loved free trade, hated government spending, and loathed Trump. His tariffs were constantly undermined by their threats of rebellion. Trump struggled to deal with Republicans in Congress despite a long and bitter struggle by Tea Party activists to replace establishment rhinos, Republicans in name only, with more aggressive conservatives. Starting in 2010, Tea Party candidates funded by wealthy billionaires stormed through Republican primaries, unseating Republicans base voters considered too soft. These primary challenges within the Republican Party were much more successful than the Bernie primary challenges of 2018 and 2020. There are a significant number of sitting U.S. senators whose careers began with a Tea Party-backed primary bid, including Scott Brown, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Deb Fischer. But they were not enough to give the Trump administration much in the way of legislative accomplishments. The problem is twofold. First, some establishment Republicans managed to survive the Tea Party uprising. When Donald Trump tried to repeal and replace Obamacare, John McCain and Lisa Murkowski were both still in the Senate to vote against him. Murkowski was beaten in a Republican primary in 2010, but she refused to drop out of the race. She ran as a write-in candidate and won the general election. McCain was challenged in both the 2010 and 2016 GOP primaries, but prevailed both times.
could jump in if you want to keep it going.
I could keep going too. Does anyone want to jump in, or
I'm good either way.
I'll do a bit more then.
Okay, good.
Oh, was that somebody?
I mean, I could jump in if you'd like at the quote if you want to take that last paragraph.
Oh, sure. The second problem is that not at all. I'm going to take that one from the top. The second problem is that it is not at all obvious which Republicans are genuinely anti-establishment. In the 2016 Republican presidential primaries, Donald Trump was competing against multiple candidates who began their careers as Tea Party darlings. Republican primary voters chose Trump in part because they did not feel they could trust the others. Tea Party candidates got the support of Republican-based voters by taking provocative positions on social and cultural issues, but on economic issues they are difficult to meaningfully distinguish from establishment Republicans. All of the competitive Republican candidates proposed tax cuts of one kind or another. All of the competitive Republican candidates claimed to oppose Obamacare. Trade is the issue where Trump stood out. Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio both joined Jeb Bush in opposing tariffs on China during the Republican debates. Both argued that the United States should instead cut taxes to attract capital. Rubio was very open about this.
You're all frustrated with what China is doing. I think we need to be very careful with tariffs, and here's why. China doesn't pay the tariff. The buyer pays the tariff. You send a tie or a shirt made in China into the United States, and an American goes to buy it at the store, and there's a tariff on it, it gets passed down onto the price to the consumer. So I think the better approach, the best thing we can do to protect ourselves against China economically is to make our economy stronger, which means reversing course from all the damage Barack Obama is doing to this economy. It begins with tax reform. Let's not have the most expensive business tax rate in the world. Cruz explicitly opposed the tariffs. You know, I sat down with some senior leadership of John Deere. They discussed how hard it is to sell tractors in China because all the regulatory barriers. They're protectionists. But Jeb is also right that if we just impose a tariff, they'll put reciprocal tariffs, which will hurt Iowa farmers and South Carolina producers and 20% of the American jobs that depend on exports. So the way you do it is you pass a tax plan like the tax plan I've introduced. A simple flat tax, 10% for individuals and 16% business flat tax. Neither of these Tea Party Republicans was actually proposing to challenge the global economic order. Instead, both were looking to follow the incentives that the system dictates. Both argued for continuing to cut taxes to attract investment, not as a complement to the protectionist trade policy, but as an alternative to it. Protectionism is the core element of the right's response to the unsolvable problem. Strip it away, and the Republican Party is just another vehicle for the globalism it purports to oppose. The right appears electorally successful insofar as Republicans style themselves as Tea Party or pro-Trump have won elections. But in practice, very few of these Republicans actually support challenging the power of oligarchs and corporations. Like the Bernie-crats, they maintain their bona fides by taking provocative social and cultural stances. Like the Bernie-crats, their opposition to the party establishment makes their party look more dynamic than it really is. They serve the status quo. They suck their supporters into an endless series of trivial struggles, never touching the economic system that is at the root of so many people's resentment and misery.
Next on the rotation would be Mike.
Cool. I think my phone lurched me out of the chat there. I actually went through the entire paragraph just thinking I was still talking to people. Super funny.
Oh no.
No, it's fine. It sounds like it was just fine. You guys didn't skip a beat, so it's just practice for me. All right's obsession with culture. It is well established that there is a large market for right-wing content, and that many of the people who operate in this market are hucksters out to make a buck. It was the right that pioneered the use of cable news to reach enormous audiences. The Christian televangelists led the first wave of mass media political entertainers. They paved the way for liberal comedians and progressive provocateurs. While much of the left still deny the degree to which it has become an industry, the right has a greater level of self-awareness. It is no sin in right-wing circles to run a business, and there is no need to pretend right-wing outlets are immune to the pull of the market. What is distinctive about the right is the degree to which it avoids engaging directly with economic problems. Wherever possible, the right advances decadence narratives. They go something like this. In the good old days, Americans were virtuous. Then everything changed when the progressives attacked. We abandoned traditional values. We succumbed to the pleasures of sex, drugs, and rap music. We lost our work ethic. We lost our competitive edge. For Christopher Lasch, we became vapid narcissists, interested only in advancing ourselves. For Samuel Huntington, if I don't scroll until I'm dizzy, we allowed our values to be eroded by immigrants and refugees who fundamentally could not understand our culture and adapt to it. For Victor Hansen, we lost our commitment to citizenship, instead identifying with groups or humanity more broadly. In all of these narratives, Americans lose their commitment to America, replacing it with a commitment to the self, the racial or cultural group, or global notions of quote-unquote humanity. These writers call for a return to some notion of a distinctly American way of life. They frame their project as one of moral or spiritual renewal. Conservative books, programs, and organizations directly comment on the moral and spiritual life of America, and therefore they themselves are pitched as the antidote to America's moral decay. They are cultural solutions to what is framed as a cultural problem. Right-wing commenters argue that we are individually responsible for the condition of the United States. We are morally and spiritually failing. By admonishing us, these conservatives are hoping that they can get us to make better decisions. In their view, we have an individual responsibility to resist vice and therefore to resist an increasingly fallen culture. We could acknowledge and perform our duty to defend some notion of American values. We choose not to, and therefore we are corrupt and decadent. We should feel bad about that and do better. By starting from the individual, this kind of argument conceals the background conditions that heavily structure individual decisions. In our discussion in Chapter 1, we laid out how the global economic system subjects people of nearly all classes and backgrounds to enormous amounts of psychological stress. People look for relief wherever they can find it. They retreat into pleasurable distractions and they look for enemies to blame. Few, if any, have the time, the energy, or the psychological capacity to engage in conservative self-improvement projects. To improve the culture, we would need an economic system that makes a better culture possible. We would need to be able to solve the unsolvable problem. How many paragraphs is that? I can keep going. Anybody, is that 4?
I actually lost where we are because I couldn't help follow a citation link.
45, page 45 at the bottom, right after the unsolvable problem.
Thank you. All right.
I just want to say when I read the name Christopher Lasch in this section, I felt like Benjamin was like reaching up from the page to slap me in the face.
Why is that?
No, I think he's still basically like he does do the culture critique, but I wouldn't lump him in with these other people. But that's
I'm just
another
not familiar with
conversation.
Lasch. That's all.
No, I'm with you. I definitely wouldn't lump him in with the other people he lists there at all. I mean,
Fair enough.
he's conservative in a sense, but I don't think he's there's a debate on whether Christopher Lasch like changed towards the end of his life to leave the left or not. But I find him as being like a good critic of both the left and the right, and not really giving a shit where people want to categorize him, which is a position I would respect. So
Yeah, he actually just came up. I'm reading the book on Prophilicity by Hans-Georg Moeller and a second author, I can't remember. It's amazing. I'm thinking about doing exegeticals with it. But yeah, Lasch came up, and I think the way they described him was like culturally conservative, but with like communitarian, like a communitarian approach to politics, maybe. And I think that's pretty interesting. Although it sounds like from the authors of that book's perspective, like he's kind of making this argument, like kind of moral argument for a return to sincerity culture, which is kind of, they're working in a framework of like pre-modern cultures were sincerity based, and then modern was authenticity based, shifting into pro-felicity now. So that's just to orient the idea of bringing back sincerity. But I haven't read Lash yet, so I don't know if that's like sounds accurate to people who have read The Culture of Narcissism or not.
I've got these two right here on my desk. The minimal self is the follow up to The Culture of Narcissism, but he like what Lash emphasizes over and over again, the minimal self is like the psychoanalysis, is you have to go back to the psychoanalysis, and it almost feels like he wrote the minimal self in response to the fact that he wrote The Culture of Narcissism, and then absolutely no one changed the way that they were using the term, like he had never written it and no one read it, is what it almost, the minimal self almost reads that way. And so it's like he just, in the minimal self, he's like, it's the political economy and it's the psychoanalysis, this is what matters. It's like, I don't care about the use of the term. Like, it's very explicit that narcissism does not just simply mean selfishness. So, but yeah, a lot of, I think that is the key, is like, if we've read The Culture of Narcissism, if we've engaged with it, then like, yeah, you need to follow up with the minimal self, they have to really go together in a lot of ways. But that's,
yeah, like even at that time, right? Like under Carter, like it became a soundbite. It's like, oh yeah, the narcissistic age we live in. It's like they didn't know what. No, nobody. More people would just throw him around, but not really understand what he was saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and he does the thing that it kind of makes me think Lacan had a point by being impossible to read, actually, like which is something I like argued on the Discord against for a while, but I'm like coming around to like, I mean, you kind of got a point, because like Lash does the thing that Lacan talks about Freud doing, where it's like you're too accessible, you're too easy to read, and you present it too clearly, and then nobody understands it, paradoxically.
I've been
That's really interesting.
No, it's fine. I've been starting to try to make, well, not, it's not just like that I'm putting it, but anyway, just my style has gotten more opaque lately, and my friends always berate me like, you should really write more clearly. Like what
I see Nance waving his finger on the screen, and I'm like, I'm not advocating that we do this.
We're
really
getting
not.
tutted.
I'm sure this is what Nance is gonna say, but there is kind of there's a method to the madness. There's a little like, genius to the insanity. Anyway, sorry, Nance, go ahead.
Yeah, no, for sure, there definitely is. But like legibility, clarity, accessibility. Like if we just want to be bougie fuckwits living in our ivory tower using pretty words, I mean, I can write beautifully, I think, probably sometimes, maybe, but like struggling to be legible is the struggle, and like that's where it does matter. That's why I don't care for Lacan and like the cult that kind of grew up around him, and even academia and the institutions. Like there is this fetish of like, look at the pretty words I can use. It's like, yeah, I can do that too. Like I have 3 dictionaries on my shelf behind me and probably 2 thesauruses. Like words are fun, but what are we doing? Like, do we care about what it is we were studying and researching? I think it's important to have fun when we're writing, but legibility is like super important, dude. I used to do the thing and be like, oh yeah, I'm a genius. There's a method to my madness. Look how smart and cool I am. But no, we should always put legibility and clarity and accessibility kind of front and center. Because that's the point. Like we are actually trying to make contributions to ongoing conversations, not like reify the ivory tower bullshit. And I just, I had to jump in on that.
No,
I gotta ask Nance, actually, though, like that makes me curious, because I think I've heard McGowan too kind of say that the risk of writing accessibly is it leaves you more open to being misunderstood because of being more widely read. I'm curious, like I love writing for the general audience, but do you think that there's any legitimacy to that, or do you think that that's just sort of like, I don't know,
I think death of the author, like you're necessarily will always be misrecognized. Necessarily, 100% of the time.
Yeah.
So with the death of the author and with like a radical intentionality approach of like, I do care about this. Like, and I think it has to be like a personal relation to your intention as a writer. Do you care about making a contribution to an ongoing conversation? Or do you care about getting something off your chest or expressing yourself? But no, yeah, like, I think we'll always be misrecognized. We'll always be misread. We'll always be misheard, misunderstood. But that shouldn't get in the way of an attempt at like legible, coherent communication. Because like that's what the internet is doing to us all. Like we're getting more and more like siloed into our hyper niche categories of like, I like this one really weird hyper specific thing, and it's my specific kink, and I get off on it, and there's 10 other people in the world, and we share this like preference or proclivity, and because we have the internet, we can safely retreat into these fragmented worlds. I think it has to be like a radical push for clarity. Like,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah, being misunderstood is I think it's a good risk to have. Like,
yeah.
You should risk it. It's good to risk that, you know. Kier, what were you gonna say?
Oh no, I'm just enjoying all of this. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, these are excellent questions.
I think it depends on who your audience is. Right? Oh, sorry. Is that somebody? But
that was me. But you can keep going. I've got my point. I've perceived my point. I have it in the fingers. You can keep going.
Well, it's like, you know, it depends on who your audiences are. Like, I'm just imagining myself, like, let's say, so I kind of, you need to mimic a certain genre in order to subvert it. So it's like, let's say I write a book or something, and it's like, I'm making an appeal to you as a cultural conservative, and then like, as they get down there, like the secret message is, by the way, you should overthrow capitalism. You know, some weird. I don't know if that's like deceptive, or but maybe I could do it in a way that doesn't feel manipulative. You know.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating idea, and I think this is like I've gone off the rails because I do this. I don't know where it came from. It's probably from my being in IT. You have to grapple with what you might call Deleuze would call it the virtual. It is I think it's the symbolic of others when you're trying to get data that no one actually experiences sensorially, but they experience the effects of that data and how that data is interpreted by other data interpreters, and that way that the interstitials between ideas, like that space, giving people enough space to play in there. And if they're not engaged in a dialogue that grounds it socially, like who are these people in a Nietzschean sense, you get this situation where people can mold it, just like you said, Brian. They can lead you down this path where they present these ideas to you with different coherences, with different geometries of thought. And then by the time by the time you've cleared all the Tetris bricks, you're down to, we need to overthrow capitalism, and you wonder how the hell we got here. It's fascinating to see it. I think walking that line, the fact that Nance mentioned death of the author, I always go back to Barthes for this. I always go back to Roland Barthes because it's the pleasures of the text. It's a very Hume idea, very Humean, humistic. I don't know. I haven't figured out how to conjugate that, but David Hume's, we are a slave to the passions. Reason is only useful as a slave to the passions. It's very much the pleasures of the text. Whatever somebody feels is good for them is going to be their most preferential interpretation. And if they don't even perceive pleasure out of things fitting together in a nuanced way, you get Billy Carson or you get Terrence Howard, and they're sitting there talking about quantum wave conjugations and not having any idea why that has any. The only thing that's doing is fitting onto the dopamine injections that they get from being able to say these big words and the big syllabics, and trying to unpack all that is this huge project that, like, it's really cool to see that Benjamin is able to be so lucid the way he writes. It's something I strive for. But giving people enough rope to sort of throw themselves off of a cliff of ideology is really a tough decision in terms of your choice of words, I think.
We could spend a ton of time on this, but I think we
Yeah.
should. This is a great conversation, though. I'd like to continue it, and yeah, we'll keep on reading though. I think we're on. Did Mike go last?
I did, but we don't have to. Is anybody ready to go? Would they prefer to go?
It would be Nance, but he's not back yet. So do you want to keep going for a little bit until Nance gets back?
I can
Mike?
go. I can keep going. Yeah. No, I mean it's. I've got the kind of brain where again, like I was not even on the call and I just kept talking. So in terms of anyway, so here we are, bottom of page 45. The last few words that we were on, just to jog folks' memory, we were talking about we would need to be able to solve the unsolvable problem.
Here we go.
By shifting attention away from the economic system and back onto the individual, the right aids and abets that system. If we blame ourselves for the consequences of the system, we are not just distancing ourselves from the real source, or we are not just distancing ourselves from the real source of the problem. We are asking ourselves to transcend our context, to be better than the situation allows. This requires us to believe we can do things we cannot do. When we fail to do the things we think we should have been able to do, we become angry with ourselves. Conservatives hold themselves to unrealistically high standards. They think that they should have enough personal virtue to be able to be successful regardless of their circumstances. Even if they're willing to concede that the odds are stacked against them, they still think that if they were good enough, they'd beat the odds. When they fail, they feel like failures. To get relief from self-hatred, they fall back into blaming cultural elites for the temptations they feel led them astray. For conservatives, the success of the oligarchs proves that those who don't succeed are caught in vice. People who fail are lazy and self-indulgent. Toughness, they are dominated by sloth, gluttony, and lust. These vices are encouraged by a popular culture. The culture war is a war against vice, and therefore a war against our limitations. For the conservatives, when we learn to overcome vice, we will succeed economically regardless of the structural impediments. Victory in the culture war will lead to economic victory for individual Americans and for America as a whole. Therefore, the culture war is the economic strategy, and the Trump administration's superficial cultural victories are more important than its discrete economic failures. Nance, we were just talking about how you were up in the rotation, and if you want, you can take it from here if you're following along.
Yeah. Sorry, guys. I'm doing laundry.
Oh, that's the thing to do.
Indeed, I'd like to smell good. This circular thinking allows the right to fight an unwinnable culture forever war without seriously grappling with the economic conditions that make that war unwinnable. In a world where most businesses fail, the professional class is shrinking, and workers' living standards are stagnating, only a handful of people will be economically successful, regardless of how hard everyone works or how much virtue everyone has. Indeed, most businesses in the United States profit from vice. They sell food to the gluttonous, sex to the lustful, and petty distractions to those dominated by sloth. Business depends on decadence. The right's doomed efforts to win culturally trigger a more powerful progressive reaction. Progressive cultural narratives are similar to the conservative narratives in structure. They move attention away from the economy, instead focusing attention on the proliferation of vice. But where the conservatives are concerned with traditional vices, the progressives are concerned with the vices of racism, sexism, and various phobias. Where the conservatives are interested in creating some notion of a united, virtuous American society, the progressives are interested in emphasizing a patchwork of overlapping identities grounded on race, gender, sexuality, and on personal tastes. Progressive political theorist Iris Marion Young defined social groups this way, and I want to interject. I think it's interesting that he chose to use the word patchwork. If anyone is familiar with Moldbug and his patchwork, Benjamin might be even subconsciously suggesting a progressive patchwork in response to this neo-cameral, edgy Yarvanite bullshit. But anyway,
Can you say more about that, actually?
Yeah, let's go.
the patchwork,
Moldbug
moldbug,
Patchwork and
and
mold.
that patchwork, yeah, like
Moldbug.
that's sort of the progressive version of it.
So like in Yarvan's neo-cameralism or the patchwork or whatever, like it's like an American libertarian utopia wonderland where freedom and liberty are kind of backed up by the almighty dollar. And instead of like municipalities, you have governments made of corporations. So it's like the science fiction novel Snow Crash, where like corporations become townships and governments and micronations. But those are all kind of predicated on commerce and capital and money and wealth. But the fact that like the progressive response to vice and virtue is it's not economic success, it's identities. It's race, gender, sexuality, or whatever preferences and proclivities you have. And the fact that, I don't know, I think patchwork, like that's an interesting way to look at it, because in the Yarvanite fantasy, capital can kind of ensure safety and security and longevity or whatever. And in the progressive utopian fantastical world, identity would be what guarantees that. And because we're all good, virtuous people here, we don't have any vice. It's okay. Just come join the party if you fit into our category.
For Yarvin, are these like cultural patchworks? Because I feel like this is the vibe that maybe this is where the Collinses are coming from. Because I feel like they have a very like what's the word, like melting pot idea,
Yeah.
but it's still very like ultra libertarian, ultra capitalism that is going to result in like techno communism. You know?
Yeah, it's very. I think the cultural stuff is all kind of post hoc. Like I think the cultural stuff, to be honest, I think all the cultural stuff is used post hoc to kind of justify individual preference. Like they're like, I want to live in a community full of people just like me, and so like you come up with this. And I think it's the same thing on the left too. Like I think it is just people retreating further into themselves and the identity categories that they've been granted, the ones that are pre-approved.
That wouldn't be like the Collinses though, because they're very insistent on pluralism. That's the word I was looking for. They really want to be pluralism. And everyone gets to have their own cultural community based on family networks.
They're interesting to read. I think if that sounds curious to anybody, read it, because it is interesting to read. But I do think it is this kind of like post hoc, after the fact justification thing. I don't think it holds much water, but I'm not going to be the guy that sits here and slings mud at people.
Sorry, who are the Collinses?
Oh yeah, they're Malcolm and I forget Malcolm Collins is the husband in this husband-wife relationship, but they're YouTubers. They have a YouTube channel called The Base Camp. They're like sort of right-wing libertarian, but they also wrote a book that's really kind of influential on what's it called, the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Your Own Religion. They're very all over the place. They're very fascinating. I'm like, I would love to talk to them. It'd be awesome. But I was slightly horrified by some of the things that they believe in, and but I'm also fascinated just by where they're coming from. And anyway, they're kind of all over the place. They're very interesting. Simone, yes,
yeah, Simone and Malcolm.
Simone and Malcolm Collins, yeah.
The
Base Camp is the podcast and YouTube channel.
Fascinating.
But so that I don't know. I just think I think it is like an interesting point where like these American libertarians think that capital and force can ensure vice and virtue, and like if you're virtuous then everything will work out fine, and the progressives think that gender and categories
You call
can.
it back to the text.
Yeah. So let's see. Progressive political theorist Iris Marion Young defined social groups this way. A social group is a collective of persons differentiated from at least one other group by cultural forms, practices, or way of life. Members of a group have a specific affinity with one another because of their similar experience or way of life, which prompts them to associate with one another more than with those not identified with the group or in a different way. In some ways, the progressive movement fits much better with the market. It treats our desires not as vices to be reined in, but as fundamental constituents of our way of life, and therefore our identity. For traditionalists, the progressives are actively celebrating vices by encouraging people to identify with their worst qualities. The gluttonous are entitled to feel pride and to think of themselves as part of a social group. They're foodies or people of size. For Young, what unites us is not a shared commitment to the American political system or some traditional understanding of a virtuous life. We are only united insofar as we are committed to affirming the validity of other groups. In this vision, the good society does not eliminate or transcend group difference. Rather, there is equality among socially and culturally differentiated groups who mutually respect one another and affirm one another in their differences. Traditionalists cannot accept this. On Young's view, if we are part of a social group that is constructed around some shared desire, when we buy things we desire, we aren't indulging vices. We are celebrating our identity because our desires are an important part of who we are. Every social group rooted in desire is okay as long as it respects other social groups, as long as it accepts the validity of other groups' desires. Insofar as the traditionalists are interested in disciplining desire writ large, they cannot be reconciled with this. Today's conservative identity is constituted in part by the desire to negate other people's desires, and therefore other people's identities. The conservative cannot affirm others in their differences because the conservative has a desire to reject the desires of others, and therefore to reject the ways of life that constitute other people's social groups. It is for these reasons that progressives tend to regard traditionalists as not just mistaken, but fundamentally evil. For progressives, they are part of a social group that is grounded on negating the validity of other social groups.
It would be Brian next.
Sure, and let's see. So starting with the progressive movement. Just a quick thing though, like I'm hearing about. So the nice version of this politics of desire is like Gandhi. Like everybody's like, oh, Gandhi's a great guy. Well, but did you think he would agree with this? Like we need to restrict our desires and control them, right? And nobody took him up on that. Like India didn't take him up on that. Nobody did. But anyway, just an example. Like he's a quote unquote traditionalist in that sense. But okay. The progressive movement has a narrative about why desire is not just okay, but an important part of who we are. That narrative allows people to feel good about acting on their desires, and therefore it allows them to feel good about consumerism. Consumption is an important way of coping with the stresses visited upon us by the economic system. People need to consume to get through the day, and they need to feel that this consumption is at the very least permissible. The progressive movement tells them that they are not only acting permissibly, but that by having desires, they are succeeding in a project of identity construction. The more the right challenges the legitimacy of desire, the more the progressive movement will emphasize the importance of desire in constructing identity. The economic system makes us psychologically dependent on consumerism as a coping mechanism. It makes us dependent on our desires. If the right really wants to rein in desire and create a more virtuous society, it needs to create the conditions in which it is possible for the desire to be reined in. This requires that the right seriously commit to changing the economic system, to relieve the stress that pushes people to retreat into pleasure seeking and into worldviews that validate pleasure seeking. This is difficult for the right to do for two reasons. First, it requires that the right overcome its own pride. Conservatives want to believe that they are individually strong enough to overcome our fallen culture through personal virtue. They want to believe that an individual can be better than their society. They want to think that when individuals fail economically, it is their own fault, and when they succeed, it is to their credit. This is a conceit, and the right needs the humility to recognize it as such. Economic incentives are really powerful, and no amount of grit or personal discipline can free us from them. But conservatives struggle to drop the conceit because, secondly, and more fundamentally, right wing media is a consumer product created for the purpose of validating the capital C conservative identity. It does not exist to advance small c conservative political goals. The conservative wants to rein in desire, but the conservative has an identity that is itself rooted in desire. If progressives are overcome by gluttony, sloth, and lust, the conservative is overcome by wrath and envy. That's why they need Gandhi. The conservatives are angry that they have lost control over American culture, and they are envious of the liberal cultural elites whom they believe exercise control. The conservatives want to see those liberal elites ruined. Failing that, they want to see those elites mocked and triggered. They want to drink liberal tears. Right wing media constructs the conservative identity around the validation of this desire to rage against progressive social groups. It turns conservatism into the very thing progressives accuse it of being, a social group that is constituted principally by the desire to deny other social groups the affirmation they seek. This happens because right wing commentators are themselves subject to economic incentives. The economic system subjects everyone, including conservatives, to stress and anxiety. It fosters resentment in them. That resentment makes conservatives highly susceptible to the conservative identity. Only by encouraging conservatives to become conservatives can right wing media attract and keep its audience. If right wing content creators don't play this game, the audience moves on. Donald Trump did not win the trade war, but he never stopped fighting the culture war, and it is for his efforts in the culture war that he remains well loved by his supporters. He continues to taunt and trigger the liberals, and the conservative audience is too beaten down by economic conditions to resist the catharsis of it. The right, therefore, faces powerful market incentives to follow a culture war strategy that only invites progressive backlash. The progressive backlash, in turn, further inflames the conservative desire to wage culture war, making it even harder for right wing politicians and media outlets to offer anything else. The economic system generates miserable conditions that generate a conservative identity, and that identity crowds out conservatism. This is really insightful. This like he just nailed it.
Yeah,
Um,
this section is just like, dang. Yeah, it gives me a lot to think about.
And just not just in the philosophy, but the way he conveys it. I don't think, like, if you asked me to write even 4 pages, I think half the sentences would be twice as long as every single one of the ones he uses. Sometimes he barely even has like more than he doesn't even have an object in the sentence. It's just a subject and a predicate. Like it's a masterclass in being succinct. It's really cool.
yeah, it's great. It's very economical writing. And yeah, I think Lash is saying very similar things, but he's using a lot of like really difficult to wade through psychoanalytic terminology that just loses people. But Benjamin is doing it.
Exactly.
Is doing it really succinctly without wading through all the jargon. You know. Which
Can
is
you tell
Yeah,
me
like,
with
and I haven't read Lash, but like, I know exactly what you're talking about because I'm reading Deleuze as I brush up against things in Zizek that I just like, I want to contrast so I can understand their heterogeneity. Anyway, Kira, you had something to say.
Oh, I was just curious, like, is Lash, like, is it primarily like Freudian terms you'd have to be
Yeah.
familiar with? Okay, interesting. Yeah,
definitely
I'm
Freudian.
curious.
He draws on like Winnicott. He draws on a lot of like Freudians as well, but definitely Freudian. And my kind of goal was with writing an essay was trying to like get Lash in conversation with Lacanian shit a little bit, like take a step in that direction.
Because
But
it
the
sounds
other
like,
approach is
yeah.
just avoiding all of the jargon altogether, which is possible, I think. So
I'm curious
Well,
though,
I
it
think you have to
sounds
do
like,
both. Sorry, go
right.
ahead.
Oh, sorry, the last thing is just, Sean, it sounds like you think Lash is really worth engaging with, though, eh?
yeah, I think so. And I wrote a whole essay trying to argue to the theory milieu, and we're gonna discuss it on the turn thing. But arguing to the theory milieu that like Lash is worth taking seriously.
Well, yeah, and isn't he the missing link between like the Frankfurt School and this? You know, like in a sense, because like I need to sit down and just read Dialectic of Enlightenment. It's like, but it's like it's a little dense right
You
now,
can
but
read it with Nance.
yes,
He did a diegetic reading on that. Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, with the homie Rudy too, who looks like Rudy's here as
Yeah,
well.
who is here? Which leads me segue right into Rudy. Would you like to read? It's okay if not. You can also just listen. That's totally fine too. But I wanted the offer to be there in case you'd like to. I'm gonna go for negative on that, so I'm gonna take it up. Wait, did Brian go last, right? All right.
That's right. Yes. So I
Okay.
stopped crowds at conservatives, and then the center's quest for better gatekeeping.
Yeah,
No,
I'll
I
take it
can
up
read.
right
I can read Sean. If
now. Oh yeah. Go ahead then. Awesome. We're doing like 4-ish paragraphs.
okay. The center's quest for better gatekeeping. The center of politics is the place where compromises are made. Compromises are made by parties that disagree with one another, but not very much. Centrists can compromise because they are largely content with the way things are. They don't believe our economic system needs to change very much. Is it for sentences or for paragraphs?
Paragraphs.
Yeah, okay. They may think it needs a few tweaks here and there, but they don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with it. If the tweaks they propose encounter too much opposition, there's no need to push them through. They can make concessions because for them there are no changes that are especially urgent. Joe Biden consistently emphasizes the idea of compromise. For him, consensus is the heart of democracy. As our economic system generates more and more resentment, it becomes increasingly difficult to make positive arguments for centrist compromises. In the 1990s, when our economic system buried communism, our system enjoyed an air of inevitability. There was enormous optimism about it. Even those who disliked the system struggled to argue for even the possibility of an alternative to it. Writing in 1989, political theorist Francis Fukuyama anticipated what was to come. Quote, "The end of history will be a very sad time. The struggle for recognition, the willingness to risk one's life for a purely abstract goal, the worldwide ideological struggle that called forth daring, courage, imagination, and idealism will be replaced by economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands. In the post-historical period, there will be neither art nor philosophy, just the perpetual caretaking of the museum of human history. For Fukuyama, the main threat to capitalism, quote end. For Fukuyama, the main threat to capitalism and liberal democracy going forward was nostalgia. Quote, I can feel in myself and see in others around me a powerful nostalgia for the time when history existed. Such nostalgia, in fact, will continue to fuel competition and conflict, even in the post-historical world for some time to come. Quote end.
Ready. This idea continues to influence centrist views about the left and the right. For the center, the left and the right are nostalgic for the 20th century and for communism and fascism, respectively. The center believes that it has a sacred duty to protect the economic and political system from these discredited inferior alternatives, and from naive young people who take the benefits of capitalism and liberal democracy for granted, and succeed in producing a competitive alternative economic system. But the center does believe that the force of nostalgia may lead left and right to attempt to produce such a system, and that such attempts can only end in disaster. The trouble, of course, is that it is not just nostalgia that animates the left and the right. There are real problems with the American political system. Fukuyama himself acknowledges some of these problems in his more recent writing, arguing that the United States has become excessively vetocratic. Too often, the American political system locks up and fails to issue decisions. This gridlock allows problems to fester. For Fukuyama, the system would run better if it were reformed to make it easier for the federal government to make decisions. He writes, many of the problems could be solved in the United States if the United States moved to a more unified parliamentary system of government. But so radical a change in the country's institutional structure is inconceivable. Americans regard the Constitution as their quasi-religious document, so getting them to rethink its most basic tenets would be an uphill struggle. I think that any realistic reform program would try to trim veto points or insert parliamentary-style mechanisms to promote stronger hierarchical authority within the existing system of separated powers. The noticeable difference between Fukuyama's proposal and the more radical proposals of the left and right is that for Fukuyama, the American system still works well enough that it does not need to be urgently overhauled. From the very start, Fukuyama is willing to compromise, to accept a realistic, quote, realistic proposal that merely tries to, quote, trim veto points or increase hierarchical authority within the existing system. The center believes that even where our system is dysfunctional, it clearly outclasses the alternatives. There is no sense of urgency.
Okay. Because the center thinks the system is fundamentally sound, it doesn't take objections seriously. When people object to the economic system, the center assumes that this is because they are nostalgic for the 20th century. They have authoritarian personalities. They are under the influence of Russian propaganda. They have been watching too much Fox News, or they have been sucked into online thought bubbles. Political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt offer an especially characteristic centrist response. They argued that Donald Trump became president principally because the political parties failed in their role as gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are meant to isolate and defeat extremist forces by keeping authoritarians off the ballot, even when these people might help the party win more votes. For Levitsky and Ziblatt, Trump won because the Republican Party failed to gatekeep. And it failed to gatekeep because the cable news and social media allowed Trump to build a following and raise money without having to go through traditional party channels. On this view, Trump supporters have no legitimate grievances, and the failures of our economic system play little role in his success. Trump became popular principally because the political establishment doesn't have enough control over American media, and especially over the internet. The government cannot regulate speech on the internet directly because of the First Amendment, but the government can pressure social media companies to self-regulate by threatening to target them with antitrust legislation. I gotta say, what's frustrating about that is that means they have to not do the antitrust legislation if they're going to keep threatening it. Between April 2018 and March 2021, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg was compelled to testify before Congress 7 times. Former Twitter head Jack Dorsey made 5 appearances, and Google's Sundar Pichai made 4. When these men testify, they get an enormous amount of negative press from traditional media outlets. The testimony has yet to result in much government regulation, but members of Congress love making threats. In 2018, Senator Lindsey Graham directly asked Mark Zuckerberg, "You don't think you have a monopoly?" In 2020, the House Antitrust Subcommittee issued a report blatantly accusing the tech companies of operating monopolies. The constant negative press is unsettling for tech companies, and the constant congressional hearings personally incentivize their CEOs. There is enormous political pressure on these companies to suppress content that the center finds threatening, and to revise algorithms to favor corporate media outlets over independent creators. Donald Trump was kicked off Facebook and Twitter. Google modified its algorithm to push independent media outlets down results pages. All of these companies donated heavily to the Democratic Party in 2020. I'll do one more paragraph and then someone can take it from there. Interestingly, Amazon has received less attention. Jeff Bezos wasn't called to testify before Congress until July 2020. If Congress were mainly interested in breaking up monopolies, you would think Amazon would be at the top of the list. It's the second largest company in the world by revenue, behind only Walmart. But Amazon isn't a social media company. It doesn't run a search engine. Instead, Bezos owns the Washington Post. Since Bezos bought the paper in 2013, the Washington Post has been fiercely supportive of the political establishment, firmly opposing Donald Trump. Well, sorry, I keep trying to interrupt this text. By buying a traditional newspaper, Bezos shored up gatekeeping institutions. Surely it's a coincidence that Congress is much less inclined to pester him.
Can I interject for 1 second?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's cool or how you're handling it right now.
No, it's like a 70-30 balance we're roughly trying to strike. So like 70% reading, 30% introduction. So go ahead. Yeah, whatever.
Okay, so it's the usual exegetical reading thing.
Yeah, exactly.
The point about the authoritarian personality, which comes originally from like the Frankfurt School and the studies they did, I think often today it's like attributed to them that you can like get outside of the authoritarian personality, but I think the Frankfurt School point is nobody can. Like we are all to some degree authoritarian personalities because industrial capitalism and mass society is totalitarian in the sense. And so I wanted to point out that like this is maybe the one of the like ultimate sleights of hands of centrists to be like to do the authoritarian move, to be like you're the authoritarians, but by doing this move instantiating yourself as like the ultimate authority to actually be able to pass this judgment. That's what I wanted to point out.
Yeah,
the
it's like
dialect.
snatching golden dictionaries out of people's hands and like rewriting them furiously in this cycle of just like I'm not the authoritarian, you are. And it's my
Yeah.
book that you should buy that says that under authoritarian I have a picture of you. No, in fact, I'm going to take your picture out and I'm going to put, I'm going to take it from you and put your picture in it. So now it's you. And it's, I don't know, I feel like that's happening just with the state as a baton lately, but that's I'm showing my hand a bit. That was a good I appreciate your point there.
Yeah, no, I really felt that reading this passage before when I was reading, and I don't know whether is it that centrists just are more authoritarian, or is it that they get away with being authoritarian more than other people do? Because it seems like they're they can follow through, they can do it. It's like, oh yeah, like I'm a tanky or something, whatever. I'm gonna post some based memes. That's so authoritarian. It's like, no, they can do it. They can shut you down because they have it in their hands.
Mm. Yeah, it reminds me of a lot of Zizek's socio-political diversions in Sublime Object.
Mm.
But I mean, of course it does, because the point being made was about the authoritarian personality, which is a Frankfurt School thing, and anyway. Yes.
Who was reading last? Was it David?
Yeah.
Okay.
Before
It's
continuing,
gonna
I
be
did
Mike, I
want to
guess.
kind of. Oh,
I think I read last actually, but I don't know
Oh,
who's
did you?
next.
I
yeah, I'm
lost
reading
track.
next. Sorry.
Okay,
Yeah, that's
take it away.
Before we moved on, I did kind of want to mention because it seems like here he's putting Bezos in like a centrist. So would it be an important question to kind of, or an interesting question to ask? Is he kind of shifting around to whoever the winning team is in a sense? Because didn't he just refuse to endorse
He did.
Kamala in the last election?
Yes. Yeah.
What was
Yeah,
your
so
question,
maybe
David?
he's
Are you saying
refusing.
is Bezos a centrist? Is that what you said?
Well, I mean, I was just asking if maybe his approach isn't so much that he's a centrist, like they were saying here in this last paragraph, I guess, or in this whole section, really, that he's involved with, that he's kind of paid less attention to because of the fact he was trying to come off as a centrist. But I mean, he didn't promote or endorse Kamala this last election, so it seems like he's just going to kind of whoever the winning team is, I guess, on his side, or whoever he thinks he can kind of keep happy to, you know.
Wouldn't that be the centrist move exactly? Just like I'm behind whatever the winning team is, and like isn't I think every CEO is like has to be a centrist, even if they flavor it slightly differently depending on who they want to impress. Like they're like they have to be with the establishment. Like they are the center. They are the power establishment more than anyone else is, right?
I
That's how
think
I would
I
Yeah,
view it.
they keep that continuation of the instrumentalization of the state for their own means, right? Like that's the whole thing as far as I understand it. And it's you could see that Joe Biden, signaled it when he did the transition, right? Like it was all this, everybody knows at this point, it was all the rhetoric about how Trump's fascist. But then once I realized the audience of his resignation speech wasn't the American people, it was the captains of industry. And he was telling them that the state was going to shift its weight from the left leg to the right leg. It's all he's doing. It's just you can depend on me. You can lean on me. I'm just going to shift my weight. No big deal. Like that wasn't for the American people. It was for those captains of industry like Bezos. And of course now, for some reason, Elon Musk has this aversion to being part of that. But in doing so, he's kind of becoming it now that Trump's coming out, or Trump has now won the elections. Is talking about making his changes to the political apparatus. Kira, you were saying something.
Oh yeah, I think I interpreted Studebaker's move here a little bit differently. I don't think he's calling like Bezos and Zuckerberg and Dorsey centrists. I think that he's talking about these like kind of public spectacles of bringing them in front of Congress to show that centrists are insincere about dealing with like actually taking on like antitrust stuff. Because if they were really serious and if they were worried about these monopolies, then they would have been much harder on Amazon than they have been. Whereas like they seem to be sticking more to the social media companies. So I just wanted to add in that bit.
No, Kira, I think you're right. I think that is what Studebaker's getting at here.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think I made the same misinterpretation as well.
I
All
agree.
right, so
And
here
I
we go.
wanted to add one last thing, if it's okay, because um, I think maybe to keep in the back of our heads that maybe capitalists are another function in this whole thing of centrism left right,
Mhm.
because I think the capitalists have to be like as the high priests of capital, so to speak. They always have to do this like um reading of the political landscape and at the same time making decisions how they can uh, fulfill their function as embodied capital.
Yeah. And on
And
that
it-
note, I think Elon Musk read it really well, because I think Trump started being cool all of a sudden. It's cool to be for Trump. It's so uncool right now to be on the left. And Elon Musk was like, well, I'm cool. So I guess that goes well together. I think he read that situation really well.
Yeah, and that when all the rhetoric about rocket ships to nowhere and cars that don't go anywhere and die on the bat, like that, like it's just, it doesn't even matter what he's said before. He's just, I've changed my mind, and that's the most important thing. I'm on the cool side now.
Yeah, yeah. It's really, I mean, is it that, I think it's that, like, shallow at this point. It's just
no, I
like,
don't think. No, I
I
don't
don't think
think
so.
that's what.
You disagree? Go ahead.
I think it's not that shallow. I think it's about who he thinks can manage society better.
You're right. You're right.
Even
It
if
can.
it's unconscious for Elon Musk himself, even if he conceptualizes it to himself, I don't know the guy, but even if it's for him cool and not cool, or like um, there's something that has to do with the general direction of society, I think.
Yeah, you're right. I think I meant culturally more so. It's kind of that shallow. Like, I think Elon Musk is cool and Trump is cool. So in the broader culture, it seems like that's the level of our thought right now. Maybe I'm being unfair to the masses of the
I think it
people.
lines up with Studebaker's bit about legitimation narratives. I think it's just an alternative legitimation narrative, and
Yeah.
some of it is definitely going to serve that, that I suppose under reasoned or more. I guess people use the word tribalistic. I'm not really sure what the right word is for it, but that process of signaling the social rather than the effectual, like in terms of like it's the have a beer approachable politician type situation, but it's a legitimation narrative nonetheless, I think.
Yeah, you're right. I think so. But yeah, it's a legitimation of who's giving the goodies out. Like where are all the treats and our food and the things we need as much as the things we desire. Where is it all coming from? It's coming from the companies. You know. Should we keep moving? I forgot already again who is next in the rotation.
Yeah, I'll go. I think
Okay,
are
go
we
ahead.
at the center isn't just trying, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, sweet. All right, here we go. The center isn't just trying to shore up gatekeeping by pestering tech CEOs. Centrists also take advantage of the fact that the critics of the economic system are divided into a left and a right, into both progressive and conservative camps. By framing the progressive left as nostalgic for communism and the conservative right as nostalgic for fascism, the center can motivate the left to help gatekeep the right and the right to help gatekeep the left. Berniecrats in Congress feel compelled to stop the fascism on the right, and the Trump supporters feel compelled to stop the communism on the left. Each prefers the status quo over the victory of the other. The center's narrative depends on it really seeming to be the case that the left and the right are stuck in the 20th century, attempting to create new versions of the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. But the Berniecrats self-identify as democratic socialists. The majority of Trump supporters feel that the democracy is under attack. Each side finds it ridiculous when it is accused by the other of being a 20th century authoritarian movement. The idea of democracy is baked into both movements' critiques. Today's left-wing authors are largely proponents of neo-republicanism, deliberative democracy, and workplace democracy. Today's right-wing authors are largely proponents of civic nationalism or constitutionalism. There are all sorts of legitimate criticisms of these positions, but they are clearly different from authoritarian communism and fascism. Nevertheless, the center remains able to play the two sides off against each other, using cultural issues to keep each occupied with the threat of the other. In point of fact, the most prominent American arguments against democracy come from free trade advocates like Jason Brennan and Brian Kaplan, who view democracy as an obstacle to the further growth of capital mobility. In practice, neither the left nor the right is getting anywhere, much less anywhere authoritarian. The left cannot win enough elections in a diverse enough array of districts to threaten to win power. The right won the presidency, but failed completely to meaningfully revise the global trade system. The result of half a decade's effort by both sides is Joe Biden and his Build Back Better program. I could kick off this section too if you like.
Go for it.
The inadequacies of Joe Biden. When Joe Biden won, his supporters argued that the American political establishment was aware that drastic action needed to be taken to shore up the legitimacy of the American political system. As the historian Gary Ursel put it, the new president, grasping the magnitude of the moment and understanding that this is likely to be his last tour of public duty, has decided to channel the spirit of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, America's most successful Democratic president. Roosevelt himself broke with free market dogmas, insisting that the federal government had to manage capitalism in the public interest. He undertook major projects of infrastructural improvement, understanding their importance both for economic growth and for demonstrating in visually dramatic ways the Democratic Party's ability to transform for the better the everyday world in which Americans lived and worked. He opened his Democratic Party to the left, believing that such an alliance would enhance rather than imperil the chances of reform. He understood the need to reinvigorate democracy in the U.S. at a time when it was on the defensive in most of the rest of the world. Biden hopes to make each of these Rooseveltian projects his own.
Mike next.
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm going to put my headset back.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Um,
We're
we are
already into
already okay. Sorry, 1 second. Already, it is clear that these fawning interpretations have no basis in reality. The Biden administration is doing little to fundamentally reconstruct or restructure the economic system. It has proposed a global minimum corporation tax rate of 15%, but this rate is substantially below the United States' own current rate of 21% and the global average rate of 23.5%. It is also full of loopholes. Charity organization Oxfam sees this proposal for what it is. It calls it a, quote, shameful and dangerous capitulation, end quote, and a, quote, excuse to cut domestic corporate tax rates, risking a new race to the bottom, end quote. With no stomach for reining in tax avoidance, the Biden administration is unable to credibly fund its spending proposals. The American Society of Civil Engineers believes the United States needs to spend an additional $2.59 trillion on traditional infrastructure over the next 10 years, just to keep existing infrastructure in good repair. But Biden's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act only spends $1.2 trillion, of which only $579 billion is new spending. Even that bill is expected to add $256 billion to the federal deficit. Biden pledged to make up for the bipartisan bill's shortcoming with a second human infrastructure bill, but that bill was slowly ground down into a fine paste. The spending that made it into the Inflation Reduction Act is largely unrelated to the problems highlighted by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Even before the concessions, the Build Back Better bill, that's a tough one. The Build Back Better bill was never about changing the global economic system. Instead, it was firmly focused on helping Americans adapt. In his speech defending the original Human Infrastructure Bill in West Lafayette, Indiana, Bernie Sanders revealed not only that the economic system would not be reined in, but that its competitive incentives make it unrealistic for parents to raise their own children. He argued that in a, quote, highly competitive global economy, unquote, it was no longer possible for working families to keep a parent at home. To address this problem, the Human Infrastructure Bill pledged to spend $400 billion to subsidize childcare. Parents would have to meet a work requirement to qualify. When this is the sort of arrangement, even the president's left-wing supporters are making, you can be sure that, as Biden himself put it, nothing will fundamentally change. Of course, even this milquetoast proposal failed to make it into the Inflation Reduction Act. As I've shown in this chapter, none of the three movements, the left, the right, or the center, poses any serious threat to the power of oligarchs and corporations. None of the three has any hope of bringing relief to Americans. Each of the three nonetheless encourages Americans to engage in the democratic political system. Each movement does everything it can to get Americans to hope that it might be successful and to encourage Americans to fear that its adversaries might win instead. Each movement draws on a small army of politicians, commentators, journalists, and media personalities. By manufacturing hope and fear, these political professionals create the illusion that contemporary American politics has real stakes. They have no choice. The three movements know that if they did what was really necessary to challenge the economic system, they'd face political oblivion. When they win, as the right did in 2016 and the center did in 2020, they quickly back away from any measures that would seriously disrupt supply chains. Trump enacted performative tariffs that posed no real threat. Biden has Biden has signed onto a performative minimum rate of corporation tax that poses no real threat. When these movements lose, they don't engage in any introspection about their political strategy. Changing strategy might be good politics, but it's bad business. Viable political movements find a way to talk to the whole country, but successful media outlets cultivate a fiercely loyal, niche audience by pandering to resentment and libidinal desire. Miserable economic conditions force a marriage between politics and entertainment, turning all political movements into media industries. Unable to solve the unsolvable problem and unable to even to admit when the electoral strategies are minoritarian, these three movements nonetheless must continue to find ways to get people to participate in the political system. When they lose elections, they blame defeat on American democratic procedures. They propose reforms to make it easier for them to win. The left calls for campaign finance reform. It tries to make it easier for people to vote. It entertains fantasies of abolishing the Supreme Court, the Senate, and the Electoral College. The right tries to make it harder for people to commit voter fraud and files endless electoral lawsuits hoping to uncover corruption. The center tries to restore the power of gatekeepers to strengthen the position of the political establishment within the party system. The result is an intense contest over the meaning of democracy. Each side fancies itself as democracy's savior. Each side demonizes its opponents as authoritarian. All of them will tell you that the future of democracy is at stake. If you will not vote out of hope, you will vote out of fear. I think that's the chapter.
That's the chapter.
Damn.
What a thunderclap, eh?
Oh yeah.
X.
That's a lot of references too, which tickles a part of my brain that I may or may not feel embarrassed to admit.
Anyone have any thoughts? They're burning a hole in their brain.
I got a quick one. I've talked a lot, so I'll keep it short. But the way that like both sides are like using democracy as this cudgel, and also that maybe the centrists are the main beneficiaries of the culture war, like that, those feel really important because I feel like, I don't know, like before I had a lot of language to understand exactly what was happening, like I knew I was really frustrated with the leftist culture war stuff. And then I realized that it's like cyclical. It's like the left
Mhm.
wing like needs the right wing to do it. The right wing needs the left wing to do it. Those people are just talking to each other. And meanwhile, like none of them are talking about economics. And I feel like this chapter kind of gives me a bit of a larger framework to understand that, and like why my impulse was like to try and step outside of that, because it started just feeling like this spectacle that like really plays into people's emotions and like whips up all this fear. And ultimately you could say, like, I can't remember where I read this is not my idea, but basically that the real authoritarian move is to say, vote for us or democracy dies. That is an anti-democratic approach, like a strategy to elections.
Well, yeah, if your only choice is the choice for future choice, do you have any choice at all? Like
And I think Benjamin does a really good job here of tying into the culture war thing that's cyclical, like you say here. But he does a really good job of tying into that, how it sort of appeared when Bernie came around that it was like, oh, look, there's an alternative to this dumb back and forth. And then that alternative also just gets incorporated into the system. And you could say this is a similar thing about Trump, where it's like Trump seems like on the right. Look, it's a radical alternative. It's something different. He's not a politician. It's a radical difference. And then you're like, but he's a president, so he's running as a isn't he now a
yeah,
politician? Like, doesn't that just
he's
get
two-time not a
incorporated?
politician at this point. Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, sorry, he's a politician. Like, if you're running for office, you're a politician. I'm sorry, but
Right, exactly.
so it just gets like the alternatives just instantly get incorporated into the system. You know,
Mm-hmm. And I
hence
think
the
that
way.
explains some of the. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go you go. Mhm.
I think that explains some of the dynamics that that Nance was getting at with regard to language. And I'm biased because one of my favorite philosophers is Nietzsche, and I guess you could say the same thing about like the way Hegel describes the master and slave dialectic, but like you know chaining yourself to this idea of being anti something, like if you it's the classic aphorisms or the turns of phrase out there. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for nothing. If you're running away from something, you're not running towards anything, you're bound to run into something rather than choose it. um it's this strange inducement of this terrible reflex that we seem to have, I suppose, intersubjectively, where it's just like we pass these inefficient objects around